Welcome to On the Move. After a very long break, I'm very happy to resume our talks on mobility and migration. From now on the Move will be only once a month, but I will do my best to continue hosting people who do really important work in this field as today. Because today I have Dr. Maurice Stierl, which I'm having obviously very difficulty to pronounce the name, with apologies. Maurice leads a research group called the Production of Knowledge on Migration at the Institute of Migration Research and Intercultural Studies at Osnabrück University in Germany. Before then, he was a lecturer in international relations at the University of Sheffield. His research focuses on migration struggles in contemporary Europe and North Africa. He has an amazing book, which I highly suggest, titled Migrant Resistance in Contemporary Europe, which was published by Routledge in 2019. But this is not only enough. He's also a very active member of the activist network Alarmphone, which is a hotline for people in distress along the maritime borders of the EU since its foundation in 2013. He is also a member of the Free El Hiblu 3, which is a campaign that calls on Malta to end the criminalization of these three young African men who were key in preventing a pushback to Libya. So after this introduction, needless to say, I'm very happy to have you on the program. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you so much for having me, Begüm.
Thanks. It's a great pleasure to have you. So for our audiences, I'd like to say that today we will be looking at the current developments in the Mediterranean Sea. Almost about 2 years ago, some of you who actually actively follow the program would remember I hosted Hannah from MSF, where we were talking about the control over migration in the Mediterranean, which was seriously affecting the search and rescue operations. And here today, we will be talking more about how it has been recently, but we will also talk about the new government in Italy, which is very openly hostile to migration, as well as, of course, networks such as Alarmphone, which carry life-saving roles to protect lives at the EU borders. So before taking too much time, I want to directly ask you about what is the current situation at the Mediterranean with regards to the operations of search and rescue, NGOs and ships at the moment.
Sure, thanks. So I think when we think about the current situation, we should maybe start with some figures, right? So this year in 22, more than 130,000 people arrived to the EU, right? And I think that's really significant because that's already more than in the past 3 years, right? And so we, of course, have a few more weeks left in the year. So I think we can also expect even more people to arrive. So this shows that after several years of overall declining numbers following 2015, we now have an upward trajectory again, already since 21, right? So in the last 2 years, the numbers have gone up again.
Yeah.
And, I think it's good to reflect a little bit on the reasons also why people are crossing, right? The drivers are diverse, right? We had also a slump in numbers, I think, due to COVID, mobility restrictions that are sort of falling away now again. And of course, we have various crises in regions in Africa, the Middle East, that are key reasons why people decide or have to cross the Mediterranean Sea, right? So when we think about economic instability, we have to think about rising grain prices that really affect, for example, Tunisia and Egypt. We also have to think, of course, about political instability, conflicts and wars in places such as Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, right? So that drive these movements. So when we think about Mediterranean crossings, I think we see a sort of reflection of the situation in the world right now in many regions, right? And on the other hand, there are also expressions of what I refer to in my book and elsewhere as migrant resistance, right? That people move despite all the borders and obstacles in their way, right? And so I started with this number also to say that, you know, there are sometimes these illusions of control, right? That we have ever more hermetically sealed borders, but clearly that's not the case, right? Migration still finds its way, I would say.
Yeah, and usually, usually from media institutions, I get this question when I'm asked the comment that will borders and more fences will stop migration? This is a recurrent question over the years, and we keep telling that no, more borders will only cause further deaths and put lives at risk, and it will never stop. Because exactly how you explain migrants, refugees, asylum seekers will continue to resist these technologies of surveillance and power.
Exactly. And so what we see is only a sort of displacement, right? There might be a temporary situation where movements decrease in certain regions, but then, you know, other migration routes come about. And as you say, right, usually these routes are much more dangerous. They are also much more expensive. And, you know, they lead to the high death toll that we see all around the maritime borders of Europe, right? We already have about 2,000 people who are officially counted as having died or disappeared. And everyone knows that this is a rough guess, right? The real figure is much, much higher. So when we think about the current situation in the sea, you know, we have to say that the situation is devastating, right? Absolutely politically devastating. At the same time, I think we just shouldn't lose sight of these struggles over movement, right? And so while the media, for example, tends to focus, of course, on the drama, on the tragedy, on the deaths and so on, I think, you know, we shouldn't lose sight of these like struggles over mobility, right? The way in which people still move despite the risks they face. And I think, you know, the history of Mediterranean migration was always this sort of interplay between control and movement, right? And so since the Arab uprising, so now 10 years really, we have seen how Europe has orchestrated, you know, its border regime to like really keep numbers down. And I think it's, you know, it's incredibly powerful to see that people are not being deterred, right? That they might be contained for some time, but they move on. And now we see again, really also really large boats arriving at Italian coasts.
Yeah, and this makes me think, I mean, I haven't really elaborated on this thinking, but now I'm thinking out loud, I guess, is majority of the EU rhetoric is on smuggling, right? To stop smugglers and people who aid irregular entry. And when you look at actually the European policies, what's actually aiding smuggling and improving smuggling and increasing these horrendous networks is EU policies by making it more difficult to, you know, seek regular ways of reaching EU for protection by creating more borders, by creating more security and sealing, so assumably sealing certain borders, that they are actually, I mean, I don't know, as I said, I'm thinking out loud, but this is what it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite sad, isn't it? That like whoever looks at it critically and really thinks about the dynamics of smuggling and migration, right? It's obvious that, you know, it's these restrictive migration policies that lead to smuggling, right? People have to pay people, smugglers, to make certain crossings. That's just, you know, how it is when you have a restrictive border regime, right? And so this fight against smugglers is obviously, you know, not able to do what it suggests it's doing because it creates constantly the need for smuggling, right? Or for flight facilitation, right? Yeah. And the more you, and we'll get to that, I think maybe later, you know, the more you criminalize migration, the worse the whole sort of smuggling industry gets, right? The more violent, because you need to find ever more dangerous routes, right? And who will facilitate these movements? Often, you know, terrible networks, as we see in Libya, partly also in Turkey, but that operate from behind the scene, right? They are not themselves on the boats, but they, you know, organize some of these, you know, mobilities. And so it's a very sad story that, you know, this myth of anti-smuggling, the fight or the war on smuggling continues, where, you know, the only thing that Europe is really producing is misery and suffering of those on the move.
Yeah, and this is even more clearly obvious in Greece, where we see a high number of people on the move being imprisoned for criminalized as being smugglers. But because, as you said, smugglers are not actually on the boat, people who are trying to cross to safety are bringing themselves. And at the end, we find them imprisoned, hundreds of people being imprisoned in Greek territories. Want to ask a bit more on the Mediterranean. When we did the program 2 years ago with Hannah, she was mentioning that there was almost no ships at the Mediterranean at that time. This was, I think, 2 years ago around springtime. And there also ship was being held at the Italian, if I correctly remember, at the Italian territories. What is the situation now with search and rescue operations at the Mediterranean?
Yeah, so the good thing is that, you know, whenever politicians try to harass NGOs and block them, you know, they would return, you know, after a while, right? We see this over several years now. There have been all these sort of creative attempts to block rescue boats, right? Spurious arguments made why they should be blocked, right? Really sort of ridiculous reasons. And, you know, if you talk to any seafarer, they would tell you, if someone wants to block your boat for whatever reason, you know, they will find a reason, right? So it can be a malfunctioning, tiny aspect of the whole operation, and then, or in one of the cases, it was apparently the false declaration of waste on board, which was not even true, right? So, I mean, you know, they come up with really creative attempts to stop NGO boats. Sometimes they succeed for several years, which is the case of the EU Venta, unfortunately. But often, you know, other NGOs, more NGOs come about and continue the work, right? And so this is also what we see now after, you know, Salvini's last attempts to block NGOs, right? And then we also had the COVID situation for some time that limited the ability to for the civil fleet. Now, you know, we have several rescue assets that come back to the Central Mediterranean and that have already, you know, rescued many thousands. I think more than 11,500 people were rescued by NGOs this year. So, you know, the struggle continues despite what governments, I think, hope to achieve with their criminalization policies.
Yeah, which is important to know. But when search and rescue operations, the ships, boats are on at the sea, one of the most significant aids that we have is Alarmphone. And since 2014, for 8 years now, Alarmphone has been supporting people on the move. So could you tell us a bit more about the role of Alarmphone and how it works?
Sure. So for those who have not heard of this network yet, right, it's a hotline that assists people in distress at sea, right? So it's an actual phone line that people can call when they are on the boats. And, you know, it can be reached through satellite phones, which are necessary in remote places such as the Central Mediterranean, or via regular smartphones, right, in the Aegean mostly. And so when people call Alarmphone in distress, right, the most important task is really to find out where they are, right? So what is their GPS position? That's really crucial, of course, to mobilize rescue. Then other really important aspects to find out are, you know, what is the condition of the boat? You know, what's the condition of the sea? Are there any fatalities on board? How many women, pregnant women, children, men, and so on, right? So you try to get a sense of what goes on at sea around this boat. And then you try to assist them in the best ways possible, right? So sometimes that means following them for days at sea, right? And assisting them also emotionally, supporting them. And of course, then also really pressurizing authorities to rescue, because you might not be surprised that the EU is not really interested in rescuing in the fastest possible way, right? Which would be the adequate response to hundreds of people in distress at sea. But they are delaying rescue operations in pretty much all the regions, right? So the other aspect of the Alarmphone is to really build pressure on the authorities to rescue, right? To mobilize networks, to put pressure on the coast guards, on the governments, on the authorities to launch rescue operations. And so, we've done this now for 8 years, as you said. In this time, we've assisted over 5,000 boats. So that's a really high number of cases. And while doing so, right, we got a real sense of what goes on in these remote spaces, right? Before, it was really hard to even have a sense of what happens, say, off the coast of Libya, right? Because usually there were no NGOs, there were no planes, no civil planes, no merchant vessels. And then, we had to rely on states who were telling us what happened at sea after a big shipwreck, right? It was always some sort of tragedy. And now that we have followed all these boats, we see exactly the strategies that states employ to not rescue, to push back, to non-assist, and so on, right? So I think, we've been able to really document a range of human rights violations, violations of maritime international laws, such as mass pushbacks, forms of non-assistance, and mass interceptions to place of departure. And so, the Alarmphone has really tried to become part of these, struggles over mobility that I mentioned in the beginning, right? And to also support the sort of autonomous movements of people, right? Of course, we also collaborate with the NGOs, and then, a lot of them are rescued by the NGOs, but even many more actually reach European shores quasi-autonomously.
Yeah. I actually have a question also that I think audiences are also wondering. In terms of the kind of the capacity of the search and rescue boats, and also the hotline such as Alarmphone, how does it work in terms of legal framework? Where can the ships go? Because majority of the times the governments are blaming organizations like not organizations, but networks and hotlines like Alarmphone, or ships who are trying to do search and rescue operations by assisting and illegally aiding entry into EU territories. But of course, we know that when a boat is at distress, we are also obliged to actually protect the lives. But we'll talk about maybe a little bit through Italy about government's discourses, but I'm also interested in explaining to audiences why this is not just a moral responsibility, but it is also not, aiding illegal entry, because, most of the times this is the rhetoric used by the governments that, present NGOs to criminalize, to stigmatize NGOs as, smugglers and all sorts of other things that has become very prevalent in where I work in Greece. This has become a very serious problem.
Yes, we see this in Greece, we see it in Italy, but also we see it in Germany, right? There are also these narratives of NGO taxis, right? Ferrying people from one side to the other. And, what this, of course, does not recognize is that people move regardless of whether NGOs are at sea or not, right? And also the Alarmphone is present in all the regions, and we only have NGOs in the Central Mediterranean, right? So, it doesn't make sense to say that it's because of the NGOs that people move, right? And I started by highlighting the reasons why people move. There are really a lot of severe reasons why people decide to risk their lives at sea, and NGOs are not a factor in that, right? And so we can see, and we've had so much research on this already, that proves that even when the NGOs are not there for several months, right, numbers of crossings do not go down. Yes. So NGOs are not the main factors. The main factors are actually the weather, right? That's always the most crucial factor, the condition of the sea, and also the condition or the situation in the places where people depart from, right? So if there are mass raids along Libyan shores, of course, fewer people will come. But if the weather is good and they manage to escape from the shore, people will cross, right? The only thing that the NGOs do is not to attract people crossing, but to save lives, right? That's a fact, right? So people don't have to risk their lives for these really long journeys to reach European coasts, but ideally they will be rescued more quickly. And And that's what NGOs have done for now 8 years. And, you know, I think the discourse are so false around these sort of pull factors and so laughable, but they remain so stable because, as you mentioned, you know, politicians and so on, they keep using these really simple narratives, which, you know, are not representative of any real situation of migration, right? And I think it's really so important to burst these illusions around migration and, you know, have people understand a little bit more the actual dynamics of crossings.
Yeah, no, exactly. Let's come to Italy a little bit. You know, for many years, we've dealt with the outrageous comments made by Salvini, but now we have a new government in Italy, which may be expected for some, unexpected for many. But the Italian elections see a rise of a very anti-migrant government. So with the new elections, what do we already see that's taking place already once they've, you know, got a hold of the power? And what is waiting for us? But I would be very interested to hear your general comments on this, because, you know, this is a very popular topic nowadays, that we're talking that more and more extreme right-wing or anti-migrant governments are taking huge roles throughout Europe, not just in Southern Europe. Whereas we're not talking about responsibility sharing, you know, we're talking about, you know, the threat of right-wing governments, while we're not actually taking responsibility. So in that case, I'm interested in hearing your comments, but also I'm really particularly interested in know, like, some of the cases that's been happening, like what's happening when ships are now arriving at Italian territories, how they are being allowed to disembark and so forth.
Yeah, so I think, you know, the situation is quite horrible, right? So when you mentioned Salvini, for me, it's a bit of a déjà vu, right? So he was there in 2018, and now we see similar narratives re-emerge, right? He's not the Minister of Interior anymore, but he is in a different ministry, which is also really key in terms of controlling migration, right? And he works very closely with the new Minister for the Interior, who is, you know, an extreme right-wing politician, right? So, of course, you know, some anticipated this shift to the right, that it would get that bad. I think is still shocking. And I think because it's very early days, it's difficult to map out exactly what might happen, right? But I think just based on a couple of weeks already, we can see certain patterns, I think, that point in a certain direction, right? So on the one hand, we see that NGOs again have become the first targets, right? The rescue NGOs. And this was exactly the same last time round. I think this time it could become even more severe or more dangerous because of the extreme right-wing character of the whole government coalition, right? So what this new government did was to try to once again sort of block NGOs from landing, from entering Italian harbors. And, you know, during this so-called standoff, right? So you had several NGO boats with people rescued before Italian harbors not being let in. One NGO decided to disembark the rescued in France instead of Italy. So they had to go all the way to France, which of course, you know, wastes resources, time, and which means that they will not be as quickly back in the Central Mediterranean Sea. And this was also celebrated by the government as some sort of victory, right? But fortunately, the other NGOs stood really firm and continued to request a port in Italy, and eventually arrived in Catania harbor. And there the government then tried out a new strategy, right? And this is unprecedented. They tried to make selections at the harbor in terms of vulnerability, right? So we had doctors come on board of the NGO ships, and they selected those who were deemed sort of particularly medically vulnerable, and they were allowed to disembark, and others were kept on the boats, right? And so this is, of course, an extremely dehumanizing process, and fortunately, also after protests on board, eventually all were disembarked. And because the Italian government could not hold firm, right, eventually people were disembarked. This can actually, I think, be seen as an initial victory of the NGOs, right, because they could not hold firm. Another aspect, I think, which is really important to note is that, you know, it's this sort of spectacle that the Italian government is creating, right? There were about 1,000 people on these NGO boats. That's a significant number. But at the same time, we had all these other arrivals, right? Boats with 300, 400, up to 700 people reaching the south of Sicily and then being rescued to Italy, right? So the Italian government, of course, has no inclination to, you know, highlight that. They really try to hide the fact, right? So they also stop journalists from certain port areas so that images of these big vessels were not taken. And so you see that, you know, there is also some sort of helplessness, even by these sort of far-right governments, in really controlling migration in the way they want to. But of course, it's really early days, and I think we have to expect a really hard battle to come.
Yeah, no, you've summarized quite powerfully. I think I appreciate that. But we're still dealing with past criminalization cases. In Greece, you know, one of the highlights is Sera Mardini and Sean and 22 other activists and humanitarian aid people at Lesbos. Their court cases, they are criminalized for multiple reasons, including, you know, aiding entry and so on. And they are charged with almost 25 years of imprisonment. And their court case is also approaching in Greece. But also there are many other ongoing cases in the Mediterranean. So what are the updates on criminalization on migration and solidarity in Mediterranean? And maybe also including the El Hiblu 3 case.
Sure.
Could be also a focus.
Yeah. Yeah, so unfortunately, the criminalization of migration becomes increasingly normalized, right? We see this happening in various places over the last years. And as you mentioned, right, I think everyone will have heard of certain humanitarians, certain NGO workers, certain captains of NGO vessels being criminalized allegedly for facilitating illegal migration. And that's, of course, really terrible and bad enough. But I think it becomes even more drastic when we think about the criminalization of those on the move themselves, right? And there, I think the situation is absolutely mad and does not receive enough public attention, right? So people who drive the boats, you know, are really actively turned into smugglers before a court of law in Europe, right? I mean, so they turn from someone who's actually escaping some place, you know, some danger, into a criminal. And as you mentioned, in Greece, we've seen, you know, incredible cases where people are facing hundreds of years in prison, actually hundreds of years, right? I mean, it's incredible. And I think what I heard is that people who've been criminalized in this way constitute the second largest prison population, right? It's absolutely staggering. In Italy, unfortunately, we have similar tendencies. Also, you know, a significant part of the prison population are people who are criminalized for somehow being implicated in the facilitation of illegal migration, allegedly, right? And so we see how more and more captains, right, are facing prison time. And I think there was a really excellent report written by Porco Rosso together with Alarmphone and Borderline, which is called From the Sea to Prison, which really highlights this systematic nature of this, right? How over the last years, you know, it has become a real sort of strategy to get at least 1-2 people arrested per migrant boat, right? So they say that around 1 person for every 100 migrants arriving is sent to prison, right? And of course, looking at the overall numbers, this is a really significant number. And so also in Malta, we see this attempt to criminalize migration. And as you mentioned, I've been involved in a campaign, which is called Free the El Hiblu 3. And funny enough, or not so funny, this is also directly tied in with Salvini coming to power in Italy, right? I mean, again, this sort of deja vu. I wish I didn't have that. But like in March 2019, you know, maybe you heard about this. I remember exactly where I was, of course, before a screen at home working. And I saw all these headlines suddenly, right? Migrants hijacking a tanker, migrant pirates, and Salvini called them pirates and terrorists, right? And so, unfortunately, the media picked up this narrative, and so suddenly we had all these headlines sort of making the case that a tanker was being hijacked by these scary migrants, right? And only later the truth was revealed, which was that there were these three young guys who were also rescued together with over 100 people. And because they spoke some English, you know, they mediated between the captain and crew and the rescue people, right? And the captain actually wanted to steer the boat back to Tripoli, to Libya, which would have breached international law and, of course, endangered the people on board. And after protests by the rescued, you know, he decided instead to steer to Malta. And so when they reached Malta, after all this sort of media spectacle, the three young guys, Abdallah, Kada, and Amara, that's their names, they were arrested, and now still 3.5 years later, they still face charges that are incredibly severe, that could lead to lifelong prison sentences, right? So charges that include acts of terrorism. And, you know, there were two of them were really like young teenagers at the time. And so what we've tried to do is to really build a campaign around their case, right? To really highlight this injustice and to create a solidarity movement around them. So we have, you know, tried to bring a range of different actors together. We've also tried to really change the media narrative, right? From migrant pirates to heroes, really, right? Yeah. Who prevented an illegal pushback from happening. And so we've done this now for several years, and I think we've also been able to generate some momentum around this case. You know, and the three have also written about their story, and we have also produced this book. I'll just show it here that you can download for free on the website. And the three were even able to hand this book to the Pope when he visited Malta, right? So we've, I think, been able to reach a lot of, you know, important individuals and networks, but it's still down to the judiciary in Malta, right? And we are soon having the 4th anniversary of the arrival of the three in Malta. And, you know, they just want to live their lives, right? They're young guys, they have their own plans, they have their own ambitions. But of course, when they are facing terrorism charges, you know, they can't live their lives as they would like to, right? So this is really hanging over them. And this is why it's so important to also focus on particular cases, build these campaigns, because they are so emblematic of what goes on in Europe at the moment.
Yeah. And they, after being held in detention for a while, they are now released, but remain in Malta, right?
Yes, and I think, you know, that's wonderful, isn't it? They are still facing charges of terrorism, but they are free to live outside in Malta. They are, of course, free to work, you know, for very low wages, right? So they can do all these things, but they
can still be exploited and charged at the same time.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and you know, I think the hypocrisy is just so obvious here, and we hope that, you know, also the campaign contributes to a shift in public opinion and will influence also the case so that the trial will be ended.
Yeah. What is the upcoming calendar for the trial?
So it's always difficult to tell because, you know, then there are some court dates that are moved on, that are delayed, and, you know, also the excuse of COVID was used for many months. So we have really no idea how long this case will drag on. In March 23, we have the 4th anniversary. So we'll see if we have any development in this case by then.
Yeah, in the website when we publish the program after this, we'll put the link to the Hiblu's website, and I assume those who are those who are interested in supporting individually, because usually, you know, people throughout Europe are able to watch this, they could figure out how to, I assume, to join the campaign and support, right?
Sure. Yes. Okay. Happy to be contacted. Yeah.
Thank you. And so before we close, obviously, I want to, you know, finish up for the last 2 minutes, going back to actually where we started, the migrant struggles. You know, despite this grim image that we have, it is quite, difficult. It's getting more and more, the slowly, but very steadily moving against us. But there is a lot of struggles and resistance. They seem to be bleak, and people are remaining very hopeless about what's awaiting for us, which is also, in my opinion, and in the work that I do, I see that regular people who are not necessarily also mobilized are feeling the pressure, which disables them from taking action as well. So in my case, I always find people on the move to actually come up with the solutions. And, they come here, they go through all the effort and the violence. But again, it's them we look for struggle and support and hope. So is there anything that you want to add of how we can continue to do our mobility struggles through this?
Sure, I think it's a key to really focus on these struggles, right? And I think in public discourse and also sort of in some of the humanitarian narratives, right, that I think have sometimes or usually good intentions, right? There's an erasure of these struggles, right? Because you want to depict them as these sort of passive, pitiful victims, right? That need sort of our quote unquote support, right? And handouts and so on. And, while I think it's important to show solidarity and, humanitarian work is also important, it's really ignoring, I think, the centrality of people on the move themselves, right? They are the protagonists of these struggles, and they continue to move, right? And when we now speak of 130,000 people who made the crossing via the sea only this year, right? It shows that despite all this sort of border apparatus that has been built, they still find a way, right? And they still struggle on also after arriving. And I mean, for me, this is a material fact of migration. And I think this cannot be erased, right? So over the last 10 years, over 2.5 million people have crossed the sea, right? I mean, that's just tremendous, right? In terms of the numbers. And while, of course, some have been also deported, some, had to live in extremely precarious conditions, they've still built a home in Europe, right? They've made a home in Europe and they cannot be, or their presence cannot be erased, right? They build communities. They also, and that's really crucial, I think, they are also the ones leading in terms of solidarity, right? Because people find often support within their networks and communities, right? Mm-hmm. So the more people have come, the more sort of solidarity and underground solidarity that we might not always see exists, right? And has come about. And so I think it's true that we live in really difficult times. And I think the issue of migration has become so toxic in Europe. It has become such an easy scapegoat for politicians, right? Who want to deflect from all the other much more pressing issues there are, that like it sometimes feels really hopeless, right? But for me, it is good to remember these materialities of migration, right? That people come here despite it all, and also the really amazing victories that networks and NGOs and solidarity activists have achieved, right? And I think this has really impacted the discourse. That has created a counter narrative to the narratives that usually come from above, right? From the elite who want to use migrant scapegoats to divide and rule in the end, right? So I think, we have to cling to that and we have to build these and reinforce these structures that already exist. So I would end with this sort of hopeful note.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I really like the way you say that, when they come here, make homes and they can't be erased, and neither the roots nor neither the routes they take or the routes they make can be erased. And so I think this is very important to remember, as you say. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for joining. And hopefully we'll talk more, and hopefully Definitely. I'll see you around in Berlin without the
thank you.
screen as well.
All right.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
And thanks for everyone who's watching us. Next month, now we're doing it once a month. Next month in December, by mid-December, see you again on the move. Thank you for watching us.